topic for tonight is skillful concentration or right concentration. And I have to say, this is not a topic that that I know very much about through formal Soto practice, but it's something that I've learned more about kind of in the context of Vipassana teachings. And in particular, 2 years ago, when the pandemic started, I started to sit with Gil Fronsdal in the mornings. And so a lot of what I know is through him and through Reverend Lien. So, and by the way, Reverend Lien, thank you very much for entrusting me with your Sangha. And just so you know, she's not responsible for any errors of fact or interpretation that I make. And I may very well make a few. So for just so you know, it's on me. So I only have a few things to say about skillful concentration. First, I wanted to say, I don't know if people have been sticking very closely to Thich Nhat Hanh's book, The Heart of the Buddhist Teaching. I was really only here for last week's lecture, so I don't know how all the other talks have gone, but I encourage you, if you haven't read the chapter on right concentration, to do so, because I think it's pretty interesting and informative. And I'll try to do some kind of framing in my comments tonight that will maybe be a little more incentive, if you haven't read it, to pick it up and take a look at it. I'm just going to really kind of go through 3 thematics tonight. And the first thing I want to say is, when we talk about right concentration or skillful concentration in Buddhism, we're really talking about what we call a concentrated mind. And very often we think about concentration as being, I'm going to focus on this. I'm going to be single-minded focus on this one thing, and I'm not going to look at anything else. And that's not really, that's sort of a kind of, Western modern interpretation of what we think of as concentration. We think of it as kind of directed focus. And there is some similarity, I think, in Buddhism, but I think very often in the West, when we say, I'm going to focus on this one thing, like I'm going to study for this exam tonight, or I'm going to finish this paper, or in my case, for 35 years, I'm going to finish this lecture, I'm going to do these 12 things, don't bother me. There's a little bit of gripping and grasping that goes along with that form of concentration. And when we talk about a concentrated mind in Buddhism, we're talking about a kind of suppleness and softness in the body and the mind. And in particular, what a concentrated mind does, or is able to do, or one of the qualities of concentrated mind, is that we're able to see our ordinary mind. And the difference between a concentrated mind and an ordinary mind is like the difference between night and day, because ordinary mind is when you're in your stuff, where you're grasping at, wow, if only I had said this at that meeting, or if only my aunt had not done that, then I wouldn't have this with my family. So when we're going after kind of the content of our thoughts, that's what we call ordinary mind. And really, we live in ordinary mind most of the time. I mean, if you think about, do you ever go through a day where nothing bothers you? Where absolutely nobody irritates you? Where you don't wish that that driver in front of you hadn't cut your stuff off and, you're like hitting the brakes or whatever? So, the concentrated mind is a rare thing and a beautiful thing. And it's really the only way that we're able to sort of step back and look at our ordinary mind. So the ordinary mind is concerned with, as Gil Fronsdal would say, we're concerned with the content of our thoughts. Who did what to us when, and why it was wrong. Or who did what to us when, and why it was right and good. So in contrast to the content of our thoughts, according to Gil, he says, there's a framework or a context for those thoughts. And that's what a concentrated mind is able to grasp. And I haven't put this to Reverend Lien yet, but I know that she has been thinking about, how it is that Buddhism, and in particular the Four Noble Truths, help us with our own suffering and grieving, and in particular the context sort of being queer, female, non-white, whatever it is, just, differently abled. And I think there's a very kind of rich and productive moment that we could think about the relationship between the content of our thoughts and the context of our thoughts. So, and to achieve a concentrated mind, or to cultivate the concentration of mind, the theory of this is what the Buddha taught. And he taught this at Varanasi, and it's part of what's called setting in motion the wheel of Dharma Sutra. So it's a very, very old piece, and it's something that he taught his 5 disciples, I don't know, something like 7 or 8 weeks after he was enlightened. So, and it's been translated by different folks, including Bhikkhu Bodhi and many others, and including really some of this that's part of the Thich Nhat Hanh book, The Heart of the Buddha's Teaching. So how is it really that you can cultivate this concentration of mind, or a mind that is concentrated? So, when I was first taught to meditate, I was taught, among other things, that I could count my breath. And maybe some of you are familiar with that technique, breathe in, breathe out, that's 1. Breathe in, breathe out, that's 2. And I was told you can pretty much not expect to get past 3 for a few years. And when I remembered to do it, I never did get past 3, because the instruction was that when your mind went off on something, like in the long inhale, all of a sudden you're aware there's a fly buzzing around you, or that the person next to you is going, and it's really annoying to you. I mean, there's any number of things, right? Or you remember what you read in the New York Times that morning, or you remember what happened last night. I mean, just one inhale, all these things are rushing around your brain. So then you could, sort of refer to Dogen and say, well, just think non-thinking. Well, that actually is beautiful a teaching as that is. Telling the mind to stop thinking is really difficult. So, for those of you that have done something like breath counting, I think it's a start. But as you know, if you have done a technique like that, you inhale, you exhale, there's still like 12,000 nanoseconds in there where your mind can go off and pick up something, including, wow, what was I just thinking? What shall I do next? What am I going to eat for dinner after I get off this cushion? And wow, my butt really hurts today. It didn't hurt that much this morning, but it really does hurt now, this evening. And so, the only, what do I want to say, antidote for all of these nanoseconds that pass, that fill with the mind, one of the most useful instructions I've heard about counting breaths, if that's one route that you wanted to go, is to prolong the exhale. And so I heard Gil teach this recently, a couple of years ago. It just goes something like, you inhale, and on the exhale you say 1, and you just drag out the 1 for the length of the exhale. Sorry, I'm not going to do it very well because I'm talking to you and I kind of like lost my breath. But when you drag it out, so that you're going one, and obviously you're not doing this aloud in the Zendo, right? Because that's annoying to the person in front of you, behind you, and next to you. But when you drag out the vocalization of it, or even if you're vocalizing quietly to yourself, what it does is it occupies yourself with the sound of the exhale and the number 1. And what that does is it leaves fewer nanoseconds for your mind to go off someplace else to what happened to you yesterday, last night, this morning, and so on. And you probably know that little factoid where, what is it? We have like, I don't know, 70,000 thoughts a day or something like that. I don't know, some ridiculous number of ways that the mind just goes off. And, there's often we feel like we have very little control of it. So that kind of, that form of counting breaths can sometimes be helpful. I mean, you probably will have other ways, and I hope you'll bring them up when we open for Q&A, to kind of work on breath and a concentrated mind. But that's just one of the techniques that I use. And I also, for myself, I try to lengthen the exhale. And of course, whenever you're doing meditation, there is, I think, at least for me, it has a little bit of an achievement quality to it. Like, I will make it through this period. I didn't really want to come sit tonight, but I will make it through this period. And in a way, your mind is undermining the whole project of having a concentrated mind when you're going that route. Like, I will make it to 3 by June in counting my breaths or something like that. So you want to, we have a tendency to be kind of hard on ourselves when we're trying to achieve something. And I do think, although it is not necessarily intrinsically so in the Soto tradition that I was trained in, there can be a fair amount of hardness and rigidness, like you just stick to it. I remember the first weekend sesshin that I sat, I was really afraid beforehand, and rightfully so, because my back was killing me afterwards. But I remember this one person in my Sangha said, you know what, it'll just be fun and you'll just relax and it'll be great. And by Sunday night, I was in tears, and I had to go teach and work the next week, and my back and my neck were out. And of course, it was only, it had to be my fault, because I obviously wasn't breathing or counting or doing whatever I was supposed to be doing. And so, and just getting hard on myself, just piled up one thing on top of the other, until finally in the middle of the week, I called my doctor and I said, you know what, I did a sit and I can't really move my neck, and that happened to me off and on for several years. And probably none of you have any body pain when you're sitting, but but at least for me, when I started this practice in my late 40s, this was something that that was really always up for me, was a kind of tensing and clamping down. So maybe a second thing I want to say, besides that, having a concentrated mind or cultivating a concentrated mind. And I will say that one of the things that when you read Thich Nhat Hanh's book, or this chapter on skillful concentration, what you learn is that there are he calls them different kinds of concentration. I think he calls it active concentration and selective concentration. And I think by selective concentration, he's really referring to what we would call ordinary mind. And by active concentration, he's referring to the concentrated mind, or the mind that we do during sesshin or longer sits to gather the mind. That is, to have this kind of holding of the mind in a way that you can see what the mind is doing. And I don't think there's a, one route or one path that works for everyone. I think we work with our own bodies and minds, our own karmic histories. And we kind of, I should just speak for myself, but I feel like my history in Buddhist practice has been, I go down this path, I go, whoa, that didn't work. And then I go down this path, and maybe that works a little bit better. Or I continue, and sometimes it takes months and months or years and years to go down this path and say, I think maybe that path is not quite right for Dana, for my body and my karmic history, at least in terms of specific kinds of, say, physical practices of meditation. So I've already mentioned one of the second issues I wanted to raise with respect to a concentrated mind, and that is that there's a softness to it and a suppleness to it. It's not hard. It's not grasping. It's not critical. And I'm really talking about maybe a kind of affective or emotional quality. Emotional quality is not quite right. Maybe an affect would be a little bit more accurate. But I think, I just think it's part of Western, cultural habits that we move lockstep, deliberately, and in a kind of formal sequence that we often feel like we should follow because maybe the person we know best in Zen or our teacher or people that we admire, they follow that. And certainly if you, work in the work world, in the marketplace, then you know that that moving deliberately, moving sequentially, moving progressively is a part of the logic of being successful in whatever study or occupation that you work in. You don't really get credits for being soft or being, kind of less disciplined than maybe what we think is required of us in Zen. So the last thing I wanted to say about concentrated, I'm sorry, I wanted to make one other point while I'm remembering it, and that is that if you read Thich Nhat Hanh's chapter, when he talks about active concentration and selective concentration, he actually divides the qualities of a concentrated mind into, I think it's maybe 9 different specific subtopics. And so I'm just speaking to you about one of those, which is the practice of meditation. But there are others that he mentions, like mindfulness and so on. And they might be, I think you could spend months, as I'm sure Reverend Lien has done, talking about these different aspects of a concentrated mind. So the third aspect, and these are by no means, an exhaustive list. These are just the ones that I felt like I have a little bit of competence to talk to you about tonight. The third aspect I think that I want to mention related to the quality of a concentrated mind is pretty, I don't know, I hope you'll find this helpful for you. This stuff takes time. It really does take time. It's not like you do one thing or you do one practice period or you do one study period or you read 12 books and it's done. It really takes a long, long time to appreciate the context of the content of our thoughts. And maybe I'll just give you one example of that. This is one of my fondest memories of Catherine Thanis. she gave a talk on maybe it was September 13th or so, 2001, a couple days after the bombings of the World Trade Center and the Pentagon, and the plane that went down in Pennsylvania. And at the time of the bombings, I was actually in Tassajara. Lien, were you there? Was I there with you at that time? This was like a work period in the fall of 2001. And this is one of the ways that I had started to practice down at Tassajara, is I would go down and work. And I thought, because my sister and then brother-in-law and their two kids lived in New York City, and this is before there was really kind of widespread internet, and the work leader came to the work circle and said, New York City, the World Trade Centers are gone. And I thought that my sister and my brother-in-law and her two kids had died. And a few weeks before that, my sister had called me up and said, I really we're doing our estate papers, and you'll take the kids, right? If Toby and something happens to me and Toby. So my second thought was, after they're all dead, was, oh, and now I'm a parent. Or maybe I'm going to have to go back and find the kids, And I was so shook up that, and so at a loss, really, because I couldn't get through on the telephone. I saw no point in leaving Tassajara for a couple days, just because all the phone lines were down. And anyway, when I came out, the day I came out, it was a Wednesday, and Wednesday was Dharma talk night at Santa Cruz Zen Center, and Catherine gave this talk, and normally about 20 people would go to the Zendo, and that night there were probably 50 people in the Zendo, and I think people were really looking to hear some kind of wisdom about how practitioners might think about September 11th, including myself. And Catherine gave this talk that went on for about 45 minutes, and she didn't want it recorded, and she never wanted it printed in the newsletter. But she said a couple of things that were memorable to me. One was, she said, what happened on September 11th, in a way, didn't happen just on September 11th. It took a long time for the relationship between the Arab world and the West to unfold in the way that it has. And it's taken various turns, which none of us have really paid very much attention to. And just because we don't hear about it or see it on the other side of the world doesn't mean that it's not going to affect us. So that was sort of the interconnected part of what she was saying. So she was talking about the long history, the long arc of history, and the unfolding of relationships that eventually have consequences that we don't anticipate or can't see. And then the final thing she asked of us during the dedication was that we have, or we keep in our hearts, or in our awareness, that the unfolding of history demands of us to be compassionate, both toward the people who manned the planes and the people who planned the bombings, as well as for all the people who died. She didn't take any questions, and then she just walked out of the room. And we thought, we were all just totally blown away, because, it wasn't just like the most important thing you can do is have compassion for the bombers. It wasn't like simple like that, but it gave us this very broad and wide perspective. And that, to me, as I look back on it, was a really good example of a concentrated mind, or the way in which a concentrated mind works, which is to historicize in a particular way, and also to take us out of the ordinary and petty concerns that we have in our everyday lives, including the concerns that go, why do they hate us? You know, or why are these people so bad to us? And I've been thinking about that talk a lot the last month or so, for obvious reasons. And I mean, honestly, most days I wake up, I'm just aghast, you know, at what Vladimir Putin thinks he can get away with, and yet he gets away with it. And then I come back and I think about this talk that Catherine gave, and I think it's it took a lot of courage for her to say that to us, when really, you know, the entire Congress was like singing the national anthem on the Capitol steps, and, you know, getting ready to do the Patriot Act and all of that. And I thought that the kind of wider vision of what had happened on September 11th was something that, you know, my root teacher was able to really articulate. And I think that she didn't say, well, I can do this because I have a concentrated mind. It wasn't like that. But retrospectively now, 20 years later, I'm like, yeah, that's a concentrated mind right there.